The city of New York in the early decades of the 20th century was a sprawling labyrinth of ambition, corruption, and raw survival. Its streets teemed with immigrants chasing the elusive promise of the American dream, yet beneath the surface, a shadow world thrived, a hidden ecosystem of crime, violence, and clandestine power. It was in this chaotic environment that Charles Lucky Luciano would emerge, not merely as another criminal, but as a transformative force whose vision would redefine organized crime forever. From the Lower East Side tenements to the clandestine backrooms of speakeasies and gambling dens, Luciano's story was one of contrasts: charm and brutality, intelligence and instinct, ambition and risk. The very air of the city seemed to hum with potential, yet it was a city built on fragile alliances, whispered threats, and the constant tension between authority and rebellion. Luciano was a man of contradictions from the start. He possessed an almost magnetic charisma, able to navigate circles of power with a smile, a joke, or a carefully timed act of generosity. At the same time, he was ruthless, capable of calculated violence when necessary, a quality that earned both respect and fear. This duality would define his entire career. Unlike many of his predecessors who relied primarily on brute force or inherited positions within traditional crime families, Luciano approached his world with the mind of a strategist. Every move was deliberate, every alliance a piece in a larger chess game he was always several steps ahead of. He understood that survival in the underworld demanded more than brawn, it required vision. The early 1900s were a volatile time for New York's criminal networks. Street gangs fought over neighborhoods with an almost primal intensity, and corrupt politicians and law enforcement officers allowed the chaos to flourish, often taking a cut from illegal ventures while turning a blind eye to the brutality that accompanied them. It was a world in which power shifted violently, and loyalty was always conditional. In this environment, Luciano learned quickly. He observed, adapted, and internalized the unspoken rules that governed both street-level criminals and seasoned mobsters. He recognized the limitations of the old ways, disorganized, violent, and reactive, and he imagined something entirely new, an empire that was both disciplined and profitable, where structure and strategy replaced sheer terror as the instrument of control. From his earliest days on the Lower East Side, Luciano absorbed lessons that would later shape his approach to power. The crowded, gritty neighborhoods were incubators of ambition, but they were also crucibles of danger. Life was cheap, trust rarer still, and survival demanded a blend of cunning, courage, and opportunism. Every encounter was a lesson in psychology. He learned to read people, to anticipate betrayal before it occurred, and to turn potential threats into assets. He saw clearly that in a world governed by fear and greed, the man who could manipulate both could rise above all others. Luciano's story is not just the story of a criminal, it is the story of a revolutionary mind at work in a lawless landscape. He recognized patterns where others saw chaos. He understood that violence alone could never sustain power. Money, influence, and organization were equally essential, and he began to build a network that could leverage all three. His vision extended beyond immediate gain. He imagined a system in which rival factions could coexist under a framework of rules and shared benefits, a concept that would later become the foundation of the Commission. In essence, Luciano was thinking like a modern CEO of an illicit enterprise, anticipating challenges, negotiating alliances, and eliminating threats before they could take root. The aura surrounding him was as much psychological as it was physical. Luciano projected confidence, competence, and a sense of inevitability. People were drawn to him, intrigued by his intellect, seduced by his charisma, yet wary of his capacity for decisive violence. This combination allowed him to operate in multiple spheres simultaneously: the intimate world of street-level loyalty and the broader arena of strategic, empire-building ambition. It was this dual capability that set him apart from all others of his time. While the city around him throbbed with unpredictability and danger, Luciano carved out a zone of control, a space where his intellect and vision could dominate. To understand the significance of Luciano's rise, one must appreciate the context in which it occurred. New York was a city of contrasts: wealth and poverty, elegance and squalor, legality and lawlessness. The story of Lucky Luciano is inseparable from this environment. It is a story of a man who recognized the gaps between power and order, who understood how fear could be codified into compliance, and who had the audacity to reshape the rules themselves. His journey would take him from the dimly lit alleys of immigrant neighborhoods to the high-stakes arenas of gambling, labor rackets, and political corruption. From the beginning, it was clear that his life would be defined not just by the choices he made, but by the very world he chose to create around him, a world in which money, murder, and vision were intertwined, and in which Luciano himself would become the architect of a new criminal order. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, New York was a city teetering on the edge of chaos, a labyrinth of clashing gangs, corrupt institutions, and fragmented neighborhoods. Crime in the early 20th century was not yet an organized, predictable enterprise. It was a volatile, violent business defined by brute force, shifting allegiances, and territorial warfare. Neighborhoods were controlled by loosely connected factions, each vying for dominance with guns, knives, and sheer audacity. Political corruption allowed these gangs to flourish, but it also created constant instability, as the protection offered by law enforcement was unreliable, contingent on bribes, and often withdrawn without warning. The underworld was a battlefield where fortunes could be made overnight and lost just as quickly, where loyalty was fragile and betrayal often lethal. In this world, survival depended less on intelligence than on courage and instinct, and even the bravest men were at the mercy of circumstance. Italian-American gangs such as the Morello family and other immigrant criminal organizations dominated pockets of the city, yet their operations were marked by inefficiency and violence. There was little coordination between factions, and internal feuds frequently erupted into bloodshed. Rival gangs often attacked one another over control of gambling dens, bootlegging operations, and street-level rackets, creating a climate of perpetual tension and fear. The lack of structure meant that wealth accumulation was sporadic and unsustainable, while violence was often indiscriminate. The criminal landscape offered no room for innovation. Survival was the primary goal, not the expansion of influence. In this environment, the idea of a calculated, business-minded approach to crime would have seemed revolutionary. The chaos extended beyond the streets into the very halls of power. Politicians, law enforcement officials, and judges were often complicit, either turning a blind eye or actively participating in extortion schemes. The intertwining of political corruption with street-level criminality created a system in which illegal activity could thrive, yet it was inherently unstable. Gangs could be dismantled as easily as they were built, and those who held power temporarily could lose it at any moment. In such a world, traditional mobsters relied primarily on intimidation and raw violence to maintain their positions, making the underworld a landscape of unpredictability. Alliances were fleeting and trust was a scarce commodity. Amid this turmoil, the ordinary immigrant faced daily struggles just to survive, navigating a city filled with poverty, overcrowded tenements, and the constant threat of exploitation. Crime often intersected with social necessity. For many young men, joining a gang was as much a matter of survival as it was ambition. Violence was normalized and ambition was tempered by pragmatism. Yet even in this environment, some could see opportunities beyond the narrow confines of street-level skirmishes. They recognized that power could be codified, structured, and leveraged to create wealth and influence far greater than that achieved by brute force alone. It was precisely this chaotic, fragmented world that would make Luciano's vision so impactful. Where others saw disorder, he saw potential for organization. Where others reacted violently to immediate threats, he calculated moves ahead, seeking alliances, managing rivalries, and imposing structure where none had existed. Luciano recognized that the problem with the pre-existing criminal order was not its ambition but its inefficiency. Factions operated in silos, resources were wasted on internal conflicts, and opportunities for expansion were squandered. By introducing a system that prioritized negotiation, hierarchy, and strategic alliances, he could transform the underworld from a collection of chaotic gangs into a cohesive empire capable of long-term stability and profit. The era was also shaped by prohibition, which created new opportunities and unprecedented risks. The ban on alcohol opened the doors to bootlegging, speakeasies, and a lucrative black market. Gangs scrambled to capitalize on this opportunity, but without coordination, disputes frequently escalated into open warfare. The legal system struggled to contain the explosion of criminal activity, creating gaps that resourceful figures like Luciano could exploit. It was an environment that demanded both intelligence and audacity, one in which traditional brute force tactics were insufficient. Only those who could blend cunning with ambition could hope to rise above the fray. Furthermore, the psychological landscape of crime at this time was stark. Fear ruled the streets. Brutality was the language of respect. Yet, fear alone could not maintain power indefinitely. Leaders who relied solely on intimidation were constantly challenged, and their empires were brittle. What the chaotic pre-Luciano world lacked was vision, a system that could balance power with pragmatism, loyalty with discipline, and ambition with strategy. This imbalance created the perfect conditions for a new type of leader, one who could impose order on disorder and turn fragmented criminal enterprises into a structured network. Luciano's genius lay in recognizing that the chaos of his environment was not a limitation but a foundation upon which he could build something entirely new. By the time Luciano began making his moves in the late 1910s and early 1920s, New York's criminal underworld was a powder keg of tension, violence, and opportunity. The city's gangs were at once rivals and allies, united only by a shared understanding of survival, yet divided by ambition, greed, and mistrust. The streets, corrupt politicians, and lawless environments provided both the training ground and the testing field for Luciano's emerging strategies. In this fragmented, volatile, and unpredictable world, a new form of leadership was not just advantageous, it was revolutionary. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the chaos that had defined the city for decades was about to meet its most cunning strategist. Charles Lucky Luciano was born into a world of hardship, ambition, and survival. The streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side in the early 1900s were a maze of narrow alleys, overcrowded tenements, and bustling markets, where immigrant families lived stacked atop one another in conditions that tested both body and spirit. Luciano's parents, Italian immigrants from Sicily, carried with them the traditions, values, and codes of their homeland, but life in America demanded adaptation, toughness, and cunning. Young Charles grew up in an environment where the line between legality and criminality was blurred, where opportunism often outweighed morality, and where the ability to navigate danger with intelligence could mean the difference between survival and death. From an early age, Luciano absorbed lessons from his environment. Poverty was constant, but so was the vitality of the immigrant communities around him. Children learned quickly that the streets were both a playground and a battleground. Survival required keen observation, fast reflexes, and the ability to read people with precision. Luciano displayed a sharp mind and an instinctive understanding of human nature. He noticed patterns of behavior, recognized who wielded influence, and understood the subtle currencies of respect, fear, and loyalty. It was in these formative years that he began to develop the tools he would later wield with such devastating efficiency in the underworld. Luciano's adolescence was shaped by a mixture of education, environment, and necessity. Schools offered limited opportunity, but they also provided exposure to discipline, literacy, and critical thinking. Outside the classroom, the streets were a proving ground. Rival gangs patrolled the neighborhood, and violence was a constant threat. Luciano witnessed fights, intimidation, and retribution firsthand, and he learned that brute strength alone was insufficient. Intelligence, strategy, and the careful cultivation of relationships could achieve far more than impulsive aggression. These lessons, imprinted in his psyche, would guide his approach to power and organization for the rest of his life. By the time he reached his teenage years, Luciano had already begun to dabble in petty crime. Street-level thefts, small-time gambling, and extortion became his initial steps into the underworld. Unlike many of his peers, he approached these activities with a methodical mindset. Every action was an experiment in understanding how people responded to pressure, how loyalty could be bought or coerced, and how the dynamics of fear and respect played out in real time. He was learning the rules of the street, but he was also developing an intuition for strategy that would later define his empire. The nickname Lucky emerged not merely from happenstance, but from a pattern of survival and opportunism that seemed almost supernatural to those around him. While others fell victim to rival gangs or law enforcement, Luciano had a knack for escaping danger unscathed, often turning precarious situations into stepping stones for advancement. This combination of calculated risk-taking, charisma, and strategic foresight earned him early recognition among more seasoned criminals. He was no longer simply a street kid. He was becoming a figure who could influence the course of events around him. Family ties also played a crucial role in shaping Luciano's psyche. The Sicilian emphasis on loyalty, respect, and honor intersected with the brutal realities of American street life. He learned that personal relationships could be both weapons and shields, that trust had value but was always conditional, and that betrayal was often inevitable. These lessons from both his heritage and his environment forged a complex understanding of human motivation, one that allowed him to anticipate actions, manipulate outcomes, and exploit weaknesses with remarkable precision. By the early 1920s, Luciano had begun to form alliances with other young, ambitious men who shared his vision of power. These relationships were both practical and strategic, combining complementary skills, shared loyalty, and mutual ambition. He gravitated toward individuals who could advance his goals, while keeping potential threats close and under observation. Even at this stage, his focus was long-term, Every small crime, every act of negotiation, and every confrontation on the streets was part of a larger plan, a rehearsal for the empire he intended to build. The psychological dimension of Luciano's rise is critical to understanding his genius. He was not simply a man of action. He was a man of perception, able to read situations, anticipate reactions, and influence outcomes with subtlety. While violence remained a tool in his arsenal, it was never the first instrument he employed. Instead, he prioritized manipulation, persuasion, and strategy, reserving brutality for moments when it was most effective. This approach set him apart from the majority of his contemporaries, who relied primarily on intimidation and impulse. Luciano's ability to combine intellect with instinct, foresight with audacity, would become a hallmark of his career. By the end of this period, the street kid from the Lower East Side had transformed into an emerging force within New York's underworld. His early experiences with poverty, violence, and human psychology had honed him into a man capable of navigating both chaos and opportunity. He had learned to wield fear and respect, to build alliances, and to exploit weaknesses in ways that few could imagine. The foundations of his empire, discipline, structure, and vision, were already taking shape, even if the world around him remained unpredictable and hostile. Luciano's journey from a street-smart adolescent to a calculated, ambitious figure illustrates the interplay between environment and intellect. The Lower East Side was more than a backdrop. It was a crucible that tested and refined him, forcing him to adapt, innovate, and assert control. By observing, learning, and strategically maneuvering within this world, he acquired skills that would allow him to rise above the chaos, challenge the old order, and create a new kind of criminal enterprise. In the crowded, volatile streets of early 20th century New York, a boy named Charles Luciano was quietly preparing to become a man who would change the very nature of organized crime. As Luciano moved from adolescence into early adulthood, he began to navigate the first real layers of the criminal underworld, transitioning from petty street crimes to more organized, deliberate ventures. The Lower East Side, with its crowded tenements and bustling markets, was both playground and proving ground. Here, young men learned that life was a series of calculated risks, and that survival often depended on cunning, perception, and strategic alliances. For Luciano, these early experiences were not just about making money, they were exercises in understanding human behavior, loyalty, and the mechanics of influence. Every extortion, every small heist, and every gamble was a lesson, an opportunity to observe how people reacted under pressure, how fear and respect could be wielded, and how trust could be leveraged as a tool or weapon. Luciano quickly realized that success in the streets demanded more than brute force. While violence was a necessary component of the criminal life, he understood that unbridled aggression alone could never establish long-term dominance. Early rivals were often impulsive, relying on intimidation and fear without foresight. Luciano, in contrast, combined these traits with intelligence and patience. He learned to measure threats, evaluate the intentions of allies and enemies, and strike when the odds were most favorable. This strategic approach allowed him to gain a reputation as someone who could navigate danger with precision, someone who could balance charm and menace in equal measure. His early ventures were small, but they provided a laboratory for the skills that would later define his empire. Among Luciano's earliest criminal activities were street-level extortion schemes and protection rackets. These were often simple in execution but complex in the human dynamics involved. He learned to identify vulnerable businesses, assess the willingness of owners to pay for protection, and negotiate terms in a way that reinforced both fear and respect. Unlike other gangsters who relied solely on threats, Luciano combined subtle intimidation with calculated incentives. He demonstrated that compliance could be won through both coercion and persuasion, a lesson that would echo throughout his later career. Every interaction, every negotiation, was a microcosm of power dynamics, revealing patterns that Luciano would exploit on a much larger scale. Gambling was another arena in which Luciano began to assert himself. The illegal betting dens and underground poker rooms of New York provided not only revenue but also an environment to understand risk, human behavior, and alliance building. Here, Luciano observed patterns of trust and betrayal, the psychology of luck, and the influence of reputation. He discovered that money was not merely a commodity but a tool to manipulate relationships, build loyalty, and establish authority. By cultivating relationships with gamblers, bookkeepers, and corrupt officials, he learned the importance of networking and influence, skills that would become essential when he transitioned to empire building. Labor racketeering also became a critical aspect of his early criminal ventures. Unions, often corrupt or under the sway of local politicians, presented opportunities to generate income and expand influence. Luciano understood that controlling unions and their associated industries was not only profitable but strategic. By inserting himself into these systems, he could extend his reach beyond the streets, influence commerce, and manipulate political structures. These ventures required intelligence, patience, and negotiation, qualities that distinguished him from his peers. Where others saw only immediate gain, Luciano envisioned systems of control, networks of dependency, and channels through which power could be consolidated and maintained. By the early 1920s, Luciano had begun forming relationships with more experienced figures in the Italian-American underworld. These mentors provided guidance, access, and legitimacy, but they also presented tests of loyalty and character. Luciano navigated these relationships with skill, absorbing lessons about hierarchy, discipline, and the importance of strategic alliances. He learned to identify potential rivals, to anticipate betrayal, and to use both charm and menace to maintain advantage. These interactions were formative, shaping his understanding of how to consolidate power while minimizing risk. It was a delicate balance. Too aggressive and he risked alienating allies, too passive and he risked being overshadowed by competitors. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to maintain this equilibrium with remarkable precision. Psychologically, these early ventures forged the mindset of a strategist. Luciano understood that human behavior was both predictable and manipulable. Fear could be leveraged to secure compliance, loyalty could be cultivated to ensure reliability, and influence could be expanded through calculated generosity or intimidation. He recognized that the most effective leaders in the criminal world were those who could anticipate actions, manage perceptions, and orchestrate outcomes without necessarily resorting to overt violence. His early experiments in the criminal underworld were, in essence, rehearsals for a larger performance, a testing ground for the organizational genius he would later apply on a grand scale. By this stage, Luciano had transformed from a street-smart adolescent into a rising figure within New York's criminal ecosystem. He was no longer merely reacting to the chaos around him. He was shaping it. Every minor heist, every extortion, and every negotiation was a building block in a larger strategy, a precursor to the complex empire he would one day control. These early ventures demonstrated his capacity to blend intelligence, foresight, and audacity, setting him apart from peers who relied primarily on brute strength or inherited positions. Luciano's evolution was not just about survival or profit. It was about understanding power itself and learning to wield it with precision. Ultimately, Luciano's early criminal ventures reveal the fusion of environment, psychology, and strategy that would define his life. The streets of the Lower East Side were more than a training ground. They were a crucible that refined his instincts, sharpened his intellect, and clarified his ambitions. Through careful observation, calculated risk-taking, and the deliberate cultivation of alliances, he began to lay the foundation for a new kind of organized crime, one that would be structured, profitable, and enduring. In the chaotic, violent streets of early 20th century New York, Lucky Luciano was no longer just a street kid. He was a visionary, quietly orchestrating the first moves of an empire that would change the underworld forever. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved far beyond the chaotic streets of the Lower East Side and the small-time criminal ventures of his youth. He had begun to envision a radically different kind of organized crime, one that resembled a modern business rather than a collection of fragmented gangs. The old model, which relied primarily on brute force, intimidation, and reactive violence, was inefficient and unstable. Luciano recognized that long-term power required a system, a network in which authority, influence, and profit were codified, predictable, and enforceable. Where others saw only disorganized chaos, he saw the potential for structure, collaboration, and control. This insight would define his rise and ultimately reshape the underworld in ways that echoed far beyond New York. Luciano's strategy was revolutionary. He understood that violence alone could never sustain dominance. Fear without order would only provoke rebellion and instability. Instead, he sought to integrate intelligence, alliances, and economic foresight into his operations. His first step was to create partnerships with key figures across various factions of the Italian-American criminal world, recognizing that cooperation could be more profitable than constant conflict. He meticulously cultivated relationships with influential bosses, securing their cooperation while simultaneously positioning himself as a mediator capable of resolving disputes. In doing so, Luciano began to consolidate power, gradually replacing the chaos of rivalries with a framework that could endure and expand. One of Luciano's most significant innovations was his role in conceptualizing what would later be known as the Commission. This governing council of mafia leaders served as both a regulatory body and a strategic forum, a place where disputes could be resolved without the constant shedding of blood, and where collaborative decision-making could protect shared economic interests. The Commission represented a profound shift in the psychology of organized crime. Power was no longer a zero-sum game decided entirely through violence. It could be negotiated, structured, and maintained through rules, mutual benefit, and careful oversight. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to merge human psychology with organizational strategy, turning fear and loyalty into instruments of predictable control. The process of building this empire required both subtlety and decisiveness. Luciano understood the delicate balance between ally and rival, mentor and competitor. He cultivated loyalty through a combination of respect, incentive and strategic generosity, but he did not hesitate to eliminate threats when necessary. Those who underestimated him were often surprised by the precision and efficiency of his actions. In every negotiation, every alliance, and every confrontation, Luciano operated with the foresight of a strategist and the pragmatism of a businessman. He recognized that empire building required more than influence. It required credibility, enforcement mechanisms, and an understanding of the wider ecosystem in which his operations existed. Economically, Luciano's empire was a marvel of innovation and foresight. He diversified revenue streams across gambling, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and illicit trade. Each venture was meticulously managed, with clear hierarchies and systems of accountability. Luciano applied principles that would later be studied in legitimate business contexts: risk assessment, resource allocation, and network optimization. He delegated authority to trusted lieutenants while maintaining ultimate control over strategy and major decisions. This level of organization not only increased profitability but also reduced internal friction, limiting the kind of destructive infighting that had plagued earlier gangs. In essence, Luciano created a scalable model of criminal enterprise, one in which structure and strategy were as important as raw power. Psychologically, the transformation of the mafia into a business-like organization was as significant as the economic changes. Luciano understood the human motivations driving his associates: ambition, fear, loyalty, and greed, and leveraged them to maintain cohesion. Loyalty was reinforced through rewards and recognition, while betrayal was met with swift and decisive consequences. Respect was cultivated not merely through intimidation but through strategic acts of leadership, vision, and calculated generosity. By managing these dynamics with precision, Luciano could exert control over individuals and groups, ensuring that his empire functioned efficiently and with minimal internal disruption. In this sense, he was not just a criminal but a psychological architect, designing systems that accounted for the complexity of human behavior. Luciano's alliances were equally strategic. He forged partnerships across ethnic lines, recognizing the value of collaboration beyond traditional Italian-American networks. Jewish, Irish, and other immigrant gangs could be integrated into cooperative ventures, expanding his reach and reducing conflict. By negotiating mutually beneficial arrangements, he transformed potential rivals into allies and built a web of influence that extended across the city. These alliances were not merely transactional. They were underpinned by an understanding of social and cultural dynamics, as well as the careful management of perception. Luciano's ability to unify disparate factions under a shared framework of rules and incentives was unprecedented and marked a turning point in the history of organized crime. The personal charisma of Luciano played a crucial role in empire building. He was both approachable and intimidating, able to inspire loyalty while maintaining the mystique necessary to command respect. His ability to read people, anticipate reactions, and manipulate outcomes allowed him to maintain control without resorting to constant violence. Allies felt protected under his leadership, rivals hesitated before challenging him, and subordinates understood that compliance could lead to opportunity while betrayal carried severe consequences. In this delicate balancing act, Luciano demonstrated a profound understanding of power as both a psychological and structural phenomenon. By the late 1920s, Luciano's vision had begun to crystallize. The fragmented criminal underworld of New York was slowly giving way to a networked, hierarchical system in which he played a central role. Violence remained a tool, but it was no longer the sole mechanism of control. Organization, strategy, and alliances were equally important, and Luciano had positioned himself as the linchpin of this evolving system. His ability to combine economic foresight, psychological insight, and strategic diplomacy set him apart from all contemporaries and laid the foundation for an empire that would endure for decades. Ultimately, Luciano's work in building the modern mafia was more than just criminal ambition. It was an exercise in vision, strategy, and organizational genius. By transforming chaos into structure, integrating disparate factions, and creating systems of loyalty, fear, and economic control, he redefined the very nature of organized crime. What had once been fragmented, unpredictable, and violent became cohesive, efficient, and strategically expansive. Lucky Luciano was no longer merely a gangster. He was the architect of a new world, a visionary who understood that true power required both intellect and audacity, both structure and human insight. In reshaping the underworld, he left a legacy that would influence crime, economics, and human behavior for generations to come. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved far beyond the chaotic streets of the Lower East Side and the small-time criminal ventures of his youth. He had begun to envision a radically different kind of organized crime, one that resembled a modern business rather than a collection of fragmented gangs. The old model, which relied primarily on brute force, intimidation, and reactive violence, was inefficient and unstable. Luciano recognized that long-term power required a system, a network in which authority, influence, and profit were codified, predictable, and enforceable. Where others saw only disorganized chaos, he saw the potential for structure, collaboration, and control. This insight would define his rise and ultimately reshape the underworld in ways that echoed far beyond New York. Luciano's strategy was revolutionary. He understood that violence alone could never sustain dominance. Fear without order would only provoke rebellion and instability. Instead, he sought to integrate intelligence, alliances, and economic foresight into his operations. His first step was to create partnerships with key figures across various factions of the Italian-American criminal world, recognizing that cooperation could be more profitable than constant conflict. He meticulously cultivated relationships with influential bosses, securing their cooperation while simultaneously positioning himself as a mediator capable of resolving disputes. In doing so, Luciano began to consolidate power, gradually replacing the chaos of rivalries with a framework that could endure and expand. One of Luciano's most significant innovations was his role in conceptualizing what would later be known as the Commission. This governing council of mafia leaders served as both a regulatory body and a strategic forum, a place where disputes could be resolved without the constant shedding of blood, and where collaborative decision-making could protect shared economic interests. The Commission represented a profound shift in the psychology of organized crime. Power was no longer a zero-sum game decided entirely through violence. It could be negotiated, structured, and maintained through rules, mutual benefit, and careful oversight. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to merge human psychology with organizational strategy, turning fear and loyalty into instruments of predictable control. The process of building this empire required both subtlety and decisiveness. Luciano understood the delicate balance between ally and rival, mentor and competitor. He cultivated loyalty through a combination of respect, incentive, and strategic generosity, but he did not hesitate to eliminate threats when necessary. Those who underestimated him were often surprised by the precision and efficiency of his actions. In every negotiation, every alliance, and every confrontation, Luciano operated with the foresight of a strategist and the pragmatism of a businessman. He recognized that empire building required more than influence. It required credibility, enforcement mechanisms, and an understanding of the wider ecosystem in which his operations existed. Economically, Luciano's empire was a marvel of innovation and foresight. He diversified revenue streams across gambling, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and illicit trade. Each venture was meticulously managed, with clear hierarchies and systems of accountability. Luciano applied principles that would later be studied in legitimate business contexts: risk assessment, resource allocation, and network optimization. He delegated authority to trusted lieutenants while maintaining ultimate control over strategy and major decisions. This level of organization not only increased profitability but also reduced internal friction, limiting the kind of destructive infighting that had plagued earlier gangs. In essence, Luciano created a scalable model of criminal enterprise, one in which structure and strategy were as important as raw power. Psychologically, the transformation of the mafia into a business-like organization was as significant as the economic changes. Luciano understood the human motivations driving his associates: ambition, fear, loyalty, and greed, and leveraged them to maintain cohesion. Loyalty was reinforced through rewards and recognition, while betrayal was met with swift and decisive consequences. Respect was cultivated not merely through intimidation but through strategic acts of leadership, vision, and calculated generosity. By managing these dynamics with precision, Luciano could exert control over individuals and groups, ensuring that his empire functioned efficiently and with minimal internal disruption. In this sense, he was not just a criminal but a psychological architect, designing systems that accounted for the complexity of human behavior. Luciano's alliances were equally strategic. He forged partnerships across ethnic lines, recognizing the value of collaboration beyond traditional Italian-American networks. Jewish, Irish, and other immigrant gangs could be integrated into cooperative ventures, expanding his reach and reducing conflict. By negotiating mutually beneficial arrangements, he transformed potential rivals into allies and built a web of influence that extended across the city. These alliances were not merely transactional. They were underpinned by an understanding of social and cultural dynamics, as well as the careful management of perception. Luciano's ability to unify disparate factions under a shared framework of rules and incentives was unprecedented and marked a turning point in the history of organized crime. The personal charisma of Luciano played a crucial role in empire building. He was both approachable and intimidating, able to inspire loyalty while maintaining the mystique necessary to command respect. His ability to read people, anticipate reactions, and manipulate outcomes allowed him to maintain control without resorting to constant violence. Allies felt protected under his leadership, rivals hesitated before challenging him, and subordinates understood that compliance could lead to opportunity while betrayal carried severe consequences. In this delicate balancing act, Luciano demonstrated a profound understanding of power as both a psychological and structural phenomenon. By the late 1920s, Luciano's vision had begun to crystallize. The fragmented criminal underworld of New York was slowly giving way to a networked, hierarchical system in which he played a central role. Violence remained a tool, but it was no longer the sole mechanism of control. Organization, strategy, and alliances were equally important, and Luciano had positioned himself as the linchpin of this evolving system. His ability to combine economic foresight, psychological insight, and strategic diplomacy set him apart from all contemporaries and laid the foundation for an empire that would endure for decades. Ultimately, Luciano's work in building the modern mafia was more than just criminal ambition. It was an exercise in vision, strategy, and organizational genius. By transforming chaos into structure, integrating disparate factions, and creating systems of loyalty, fear, and economic control, he redefined the very nature of organized crime. What had once been fragmented, unpredictable, and violent became cohesive, efficient, and strategically expansive. Lucky Luciano was no longer merely a gangster. He was the architect of a new world, a visionary who understood that true power required both intellect and audacity, both structure and human insight. In reshaping the underworld, he left a legacy that would influence crime, economics, and human behavior for generations to come. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved beyond mere survival and influence. He had begun to build a fully operational criminal empire, one that blended vision, strategy, and economics into a single, disciplined structure. This was not the chaotic, street-level racketeering of earlier decades. It was organized, hierarchical, and meticulously managed. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to transform illegal activity into structured enterprises, converting vices like gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering into consistent, profitable, and scalable operations. He approached crime with the mind of a businessman, carefully balancing risk, loyalty, and opportunity, while maintaining strict control over both personnel and territory. Every venture was a calculated step, a piece of a larger vision in which power and money reinforced one another. Gambling was among the first pillars of Luciano's enterprise. Illegal betting dens, underground casinos, and high-stakes poker rooms provided not only immediate revenue but also opportunities for influence and intelligence. By controlling these operations, Luciano could attract a diverse clientele, ranging from local workers to influential businessmen willing to wager for both profit and prestige. These venues were not just about money, they were arenas for understanding human behavior, loyalty, and leverage. Luciano observed patterns, identified potential threats, and recruited allies from those who proved reliable. The revenue from gambling was substantial, but its strategic value was even greater. It created networks of obligation, dependency, and influence that extended across the city. Bootlegging was another central component of Luciano's empire, particularly during the Prohibition era. The ban on alcohol created an unprecedented black market, and Luciano was quick to exploit it. Unlike many rival operators who relied on force and intimidation alone, he implemented a system of supply chains, distribution networks, and alliances that maximized profit while minimizing risk. Speakeasies, clandestine distilleries, and transportation routes were all integrated into a larger operational framework, allowing Luciano to dominate the market with efficiency and subtlety. Control over the flow of alcohol also provided leverage over political figures, law enforcement, and other gangs, further extending his influence beyond the criminal underworld. Labor racketeering offered yet another avenue for both profit and power. Unions, especially in industries like construction and shipping, were susceptible to infiltration, and Luciano recognized the strategic value of controlling them. By inserting loyal operatives into union leadership positions, he could manipulate labor disputes, extract bribes, and influence contracts to benefit his organization. This control extended his reach into legitimate business sectors, providing a veneer of legitimacy and an additional revenue stream that reinforced the broader criminal network. It also allowed him to manage potential threats within the labor force and maintain alliances across industries, demonstrating his understanding that power was both economic and systemic. Luciano's approach to revenue streams was highly strategic. Rather than relying on a single source of income, he diversified across multiple interconnected operations. Gambling profits could support bootlegging ventures. Control of unions could protect both activities and provide leverage over competitors. Each enterprise was interdependent, creating a network of resilience that allowed the organization to withstand external pressures, whether from law enforcement, rival gangs, or economic fluctuations. This integration was unprecedented in organized crime, transforming what had once been fragmented and reactive into cohesive and sustainable. Personnel management was equally critical. Luciano recognized that his empire's success depended on the loyalty, competence, and discretion of those operating within it. He selected lieutenants, enforcers, and managers based on a combination of skill, ambition, and trustworthiness, creating a hierarchy in which authority and responsibility were clearly delineated. Rewards for loyalty were tangible, financial gain, protection, and status, while betrayal carried swift and irreversible consequences. By embedding these principles into every aspect of his operations, Luciano created a disciplined organization capable of executing complex schemes with precision. His ability to combine psychology, strategy, and management was as remarkable as his economic acumen. The psychological dimension of his empire cannot be overstated. Luciano understood that people respond not only to money and power but also to perception and influence. Fear, respect, and opportunity were tools he wielded with subtlety. Employees and allies internalized loyalty as both self-interest and principle, creating a culture in which adherence to rules was as much about survival as it was about advancement. Even rivals were manipulated through perception. Strategic acts of generosity or decisive violence communicated power, capability, and inevitability. In this way, Luciano's empire operated not just as a financial machine but as a psychologically cohesive system, in which the behavior of every individual was guided, anticipated, and influenced. Luciano's ability to integrate multiple criminal enterprises into a coherent system marked a turning point in the history of organized crime. Where earlier generations of gangsters had operated in silos, gambling in one neighborhood, bootlegging in another, labor disputes handled independently, Luciano created synergy. Profits, influence, and loyalty were interconnected, each reinforcing the other. The empire was resilient, adaptable, and capable of long-term growth, setting a model that would be emulated by organized crime worldwide. He demonstrated that criminal operations could be both profitable and strategic, combining ruthless efficiency with forward-looking vision. By the late 1920s, Luciano's operations had become a microcosm of a criminal state. He controlled territory, revenue streams, personnel, and alliances with a precision that rivaled legitimate business leaders. The streets of New York, once fragmented and violent, were now governed by an invisible order, a structure in which loyalty, strategy, and opportunity dictated outcomes. Money, murder, and vision were no longer disparate elements. They were integrated into a system that balanced risk, reward, and authority. Luciano had achieved something unprecedented. He had turned crime into an enterprise, chaos into structure, and ambition into empire. Ultimately, Luciano's empire was more than a collection of illegal ventures. It was a manifestation of his intellect, foresight, and understanding of human behavior. Through gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering, he demonstrated that organized crime could be systematic, disciplined, and profitable. More importantly, he proved that power could be managed, alliances negotiated, and loyalty codified into a functional, durable system. This period of empire building solidified Luciano's status as a visionary in the underworld, laying the foundation for the Commission and establishing the principles that would govern organized crime for generations. His genius was in seeing beyond immediate profit to long-term control, in shaping a world where money, strategy, and psychology were inextricably linked. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had grown beyond a simple network of criminal ventures. It had become a complex ecosystem of alliances, rivalries, and strategic interdependencies. The underworld was no longer a chaotic collection of independent gangs, it was a delicate balance of power, managed through negotiation, intimidation, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. Yet with expansion came increased visibility, scrutiny, and competition. Allies could become enemies, and enemies could become unexpected collaborators. Navigating this treacherous landscape required not just ambition and intelligence, but an almost instinctive understanding of human behavior, a talent for diplomacy, and the courage to strike decisively when necessary. The very success of Luciano's empire had made him a target, and the stakes of every decision had never been higher. Alliances were the backbone of his strategy. Luciano understood that power was amplified when disparate factions could be united under a shared vision, or at least a shared set of rules. He forged relationships with influential figures in rival gangs, offering incentives that ranged from profit-sharing to protection. These alliances were not born from trust alone. They were carefully calculated arrangements in which each party understood the risks and rewards. Luciano excelled at structuring deals that aligned interests, turning potential threats into collaborators. He recognized that the mafia's strength was not just in muscle, but in networks of obligation, loyalty, and interdependence. The art of alliance building required patience, subtlety, and a keen awareness of human ambition, and Luciano mastered it with remarkable precision. Yet alliances were inherently unstable. Rivalry and betrayal lurked beneath every handshake. Power, after all, was never shared willingly for long. One miscalculation could spark conflict, turning an ally into a mortal enemy. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to anticipate these shifts, to read the underlying motives and ambitions of his associates, and to act before threats could solidify. Negotiation was not enough. He often combined diplomacy with strategic intimidation, making it clear that loyalty was expected, while defiance would have consequences. His ability to maintain this balance allowed him to keep rival factions in line while expanding his influence, a feat few of his contemporaries could replicate. Betrayal was an ever-present danger. In the violent world of organized crime, loyalties were conditional, and ambition could override any sense of camaraderie. Luciano had to navigate a landscape where friends might betray him for short-term gain, and enemies might feign cooperation to strike at the right moment. He mitigated these risks through a combination of surveillance, selective delegation, and psychological insight. He placed trusted lieutenants in key positions, ensuring that critical operations were managed by individuals whose loyalty had been tested and proven. At the same time, he maintained a system of intelligence gathering that allowed him to anticipate disloyalty before it could escalate. In this world, foresight was as lethal a weapon as any firearm, and Luciano wielded it with surgical precision. The dynamics of power within the mafia also required careful management of perception. Luciano understood that reputation was currency. A figure perceived as weak could be challenged. One perceived as invincible could manipulate rivals through fear and respect. He cultivated an image that balanced approachability with menace, creating a psychological advantage that extended beyond his immediate organization. Allies felt protected under his leadership, rivals hesitated before challenging him, and subordinates understood that compliance could lead to opportunity while betrayal would be met with swift retribution. In this sense, Luciano's power was both structural and psychological, operating simultaneously through systems of organization and manipulation of human behavior. Government scrutiny added another layer of complexity. Law enforcement, increasingly aware of the sophisticated networks being built by figures like Luciano, posed a constant threat. Indictments, investigations, and surveillance were not merely inconveniences, they were existential risks. Managing these pressures required careful coordination, legal acumen, and, when necessary, corruption. Luciano's alliances extended into political and law enforcement spheres, allowing him to create buffers against intervention. Bribes, favors, and calculated relationships with officials ensured that his operations could continue with minimal disruption, while rivals who lacked such sophistication were vulnerable to legal action or violent removal. The ability to operate under the watchful eyes of both law enforcement and competitors was a testament to Luciano's strategic brilliance. Rivalries were equally complex. Other ambitious mobsters saw the rise of Luciano as a direct threat, and challenges to his authority were inevitable. Conflict was often a matter of survival as much as ambition. Luciano managed these rivalries with a combination of negotiation, intimidation, and decisive action. Some opponents were integrated into his system through alliances or financial incentives. Others were neutralized through violence or exile. Each action was calculated, aimed not merely at immediate gain but at long-term stability and the reinforcement of his authority. By controlling the narrative of power and demonstrating both the consequences of defiance and the benefits of loyalty, Luciano maintained dominance over a volatile and often treacherous landscape. The era also demanded flexibility. Alliances could shift, enemies could cooperate, and political circumstances could change overnight. Luciano's ability to adapt, restructuring alliances, renegotiating terms, and preemptively addressing potential conflicts, was a key factor in his enduring success. He treated every relationship as dynamic, constantly evaluating risks, opportunities, and psychological undercurrents. The management of these complex networks was akin to running a multinational corporation under constant threat of sabotage. Success depended on foresight, discipline, and the ability to blend strategy with human intuition. By the mid-1930s, the combination of alliances, rivalries, and strategic governance had created a system in which Luciano's power was both centralized and resilient. He had managed to unite previously fractious factions under a shared code of conduct, an economic framework, and a psychological system of loyalty and fear. The hidden war of New York's underworld, previously chaotic and bloody, was now organized, predictable, and profitable, largely due to Luciano's careful orchestration of relationships and his mastery of both diplomacy and deterrence. In doing so, he not only solidified his empire but also transformed the very nature of organized crime, laying the groundwork for a legacy that would endure long after he left the streets. Even the most carefully constructed empires are vulnerable to unforeseen forces, and by the late 1930s, Lucky Luciano's carefully orchestrated world began to show cracks. Despite his brilliance in consolidating power, managing alliances, and integrating criminal enterprises, external pressures and internal vulnerabilities were mounting. Law enforcement, increasingly sophisticated and determined, had begun to focus on his operations, while rival factions, though largely subdued, still watched for weaknesses to exploit. The very visibility of his empire, its unprecedented scale and organization, had made him a target. What had once been a network operating under the radar now drew attention, scrutiny, and envy from all corners of the underworld and beyond. Luciano, for all his foresight, was entering the period where luck, strategy, and vulnerability intersected, where the fall of even the most powerful could begin. The initial signs of his empire's vulnerability were subtle but undeniable. Corruption and alliances could only shield him for so long. Government agents were increasingly determined, leveraging new investigative techniques, wiretaps, informants, and coordinated prosecutions. The public was becoming more aware of organized crime through sensationalized media coverage, fueling political pressure for action. As his empire expanded, so too did its footprint, creating more opportunities for errors, exposure, and betrayal. Even those closest to Luciano were not immune to temptation or fear, and the same psychological tools that had consolidated his empire, loyalty, fear, and obligation, could be undermined by coercion, financial incentive, or self-preservation. The tension between control and exposure was becoming impossible to ignore. One of the pivotal vulnerabilities emerged within his inner circle. While Luciano had meticulously cultivated loyalty, the human element always carried unpredictability. Some lieutenants, once loyal, began to feel the pressures of scrutiny or the allure of negotiating with law enforcement. Others, ambitious and restless, quietly contemplated their own agendas. In an organization that thrived on hierarchy, secrecy, and discipline, even a single breach could ripple across the empire. The hidden war that had been managed through alliances and intimidation now faced a new battlefield: infiltration, betrayal, and internal instability. Luciano understood that survival required vigilance, but even his unparalleled foresight could not eliminate every risk inherent in human ambition. The arrest that would mark the beginning of Luciano's fall was both a shock and an inevitability. After years of careful management, the combined pressure of law enforcement, media, and political urgency culminated in a case that aimed to dismantle the empire at its core. The charges, centered on violations ranging from prostitution and gambling to organized criminal activity, were designed not just to punish but to destabilize the network he had built. The arrest was a calculated move by authorities who had watched his rise with both fascination and frustration, and it demonstrated the limits of even the most sophisticated criminal organization. The hand of the law had reached the empire, and Luciano's control, though formidable, was now constrained by forces beyond his direct manipulation. Betrayal amplified the impact of this arrest. While Luciano had carefully cultivated loyalty, fear, and respect, the combination of legal pressure, opportunity, and self-interest began to fracture the inner circle. Some former allies cooperated with authorities in exchange for leniency, while others sought to protect their own positions by distancing themselves from him. The psychological tension that had previously reinforced his authority was now working against him. Individuals who had once feared and respected him now evaluated risk differently, prioritizing personal survival over collective loyalty. It was a stark demonstration that even the most disciplined systems of control are vulnerable to the unpredictability of human behavior under duress. The consequences of his arrest were immediate and dramatic. The empire, while resilient, faced operational disruption. Key lieutenants were scrutinized, revenue streams were threatened, and rival factions began testing the boundaries of influence once tightly controlled by Luciano. The hidden war of the underworld intensified, but now it was compounded by the vulnerability of leadership. His absence, even temporary, exposed the cracks that had been managed through the delicate interplay of fear, loyalty, and strategic alliances. The balance that had maintained order and stability was suddenly under siege, illustrating the precarious nature of power, even when wielded by a figure as skilled as Luciano. Psychologically, the fall marked a turning point in Luciano's personal journey. The arrest forced him to confront the limitations of his control and the inevitability of consequences, no matter how well planned his operations had been. It underscored the fragility of human systems, revealing that even genius, strategy, and foresight could not fully insulate one from betrayal, legal action, or the shifting tides of fortune. Yet it also highlighted the resilience of his intellect and his adaptability. Even as the first cracks appeared in his empire, Luciano began calculating responses, evaluating options, and anticipating moves by both law enforcement and potential traitors. The fall was not yet final. It was the beginning of a new high-stakes battle that would test every skill he had cultivated over decades. The period also illuminated the contrast that defined his life: power versus vulnerability, loyalty versus betrayal, and foresight versus unpredictability. For all his ability to orchestrate and manage, Luciano faced forces that could not be fully controlled. The streets, which had once been his proving ground, were now arenas of uncertainty, where law, rival ambition, and human weakness threatened the stability he had worked so meticulously to build. It was a moment that crystallized the inherent tension in the life of a figure who had sought to turn chaos into order. The very systems that enabled power also created exposure. The fall, when it began, was not sudden. It was the accumulation of pressures, vulnerabilities, and the inevitable consequences of human ambition colliding with the mechanisms of law and justice. By the end of this stage, Luciano's empire remained formidable, but the landscape had shifted irreversibly. Arrest and betrayal were no longer abstract threats. They were immediate realities. The hidden war that had once been managed through fear, loyalty, and strategy was now compounded by legal action, internal fracture, and heightened scrutiny. The fall had begun, and with it, a period of high-stakes maneuvering, resilience, and confrontation with forces beyond the reach of even the most brilliant criminal mind. For Luciano, the challenge was no longer merely the consolidation of power. It was survival, adaptation, and the navigation of a complex web of human ambition and institutional pressure that threatened to dismantle everything he had built. The courtroom that would become the stage for Lucky Luciano's trial was not merely a place of legal procedure. It was a theater in which power, reputation, and public perception collided. The arrest had signaled the beginning of his fall, but the trial transformed it into a spectacle that would expose the vulnerabilities of even the most formidable criminal mind. Journalists, politicians, law enforcement officials, and members of the public converged on the courthouse, eager to witness the unraveling of the man who had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in history. For Luciano, the trial was both a personal and strategic crucible, testing not only his ability to survive legal scrutiny but also his capacity to navigate the psychological and social currents that flowed through every aspect of the case. The charges against him were extensive and meticulously documented. They encompassed a range of criminal activities including prostitution, gambling, labor racketeering, and conspiracy, each carefully chosen to demonstrate the breadth and depth of his influence. The prosecution presented a portrait of a man who had not only violated the law but had created a criminal infrastructure that threatened the social and moral order. The courtroom became a stage for contrasts: the charismatic, calculated figure of Luciano versus the moral authority of law and society, the meticulously organized empire versus the human consequences of illegal enterprise. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, and every cross-examination added tension, drama, and moral complexity to the unfolding narrative. Luciano's legal team faced enormous challenges. The prosecution had built a compelling case, supported by witnesses, documentation, and a strategy designed to highlight both his criminal activities and the systemic nature of his organization. Defense attorneys had to contend with the weight of evidence, the intensity of public scrutiny, and the emotional atmosphere that pervaded the courtroom. Yet even in this environment, Luciano remained calculating, observing the dynamics, managing perception, and leveraging influence wherever possible. His understanding of human psychology, honed over decades in the underworld, became an asset. He could anticipate the reactions of jurors, witnesses, and the media, using subtle cues, demeanor, and strategy to shape impressions and influence outcomes. The trial itself was a masterclass in drama, a spectacle that blurred the line between legal procedure and public theater. Journalists reported minute details, often sensationalized, feeding the public's fascination with the mafia, crime, and the man who had risen above it all. Each day brought new revelations, testimony, and tension, amplifying both the stakes and the psychological pressure on all involved. For Luciano, the courtroom was not just a place to defend against accusations. It was a venue in which perception mattered as much as evidence. He understood that reputation, image, and public narrative could be leveraged even under the harshest scrutiny, shaping both the outcome of the trial and the legacy that would endure long after the gavel fell. The moral dimension of the trial added another layer of complexity. Luciano's activities had not only broken the law but had challenged the social and cultural norms of the time. Prostitutes, gamblers, and laborers were caught in the web of his empire, their stories used by the prosecution to demonstrate both exploitation and societal impact. The contrast between his calculated efficiency and the human consequences of his empire highlighted the ethical tensions inherent in organized crime. For the public and for the jurors, the trial became a narrative not just of lawbreaking but of morality, power, and the consequences of ambition unfettered by conventional ethics. It was a crucible in which not only Luciano but the broader phenomenon of organized crime was being judged. The courtroom dynamics were further complicated by the interplay of fear and influence. Witnesses, some loyal, some coerced, and some fearful, navigated a treacherous landscape. The Code of Omerta, which had long governed loyalty and silence in the underworld, came into conflict with the pressures of the law. Luciano's ability to manage perception extended to the courtroom itself. Subtle gestures, calculated interactions, and controlled demeanor sent signals to allies, opponents, and observers alike. Each moment of the trial was laden with subtext, the psychological warfare between control, defiance, and negotiation playing out under the watchful eyes of the legal system and the public. The verdict and sentencing marked a turning point, both personally for Luciano and historically for organized crime. Conviction represented not just a legal judgment but the disruption of an empire, a moment in which the intricate systems of loyalty, fear, and influence he had built were subjected to external enforcement. The sentence was harsh, a reminder that no system of organization, no matter how sophisticated, could fully insulate a criminal mastermind from the combined forces of law and society. Yet even in the face of judgment, Luciano's strategic mind remained engaged, calculating potential paths forward, considering alliances, and preparing for eventual leverage, influence, and survival. The fall was real, but it was also a prelude to adaptation and resilience. The trial also underscored the contrast between myth and reality. To the public, Luciano was the embodiment of the mafia's power, a larger-than-life figure capable of shaping the underworld and outmaneuvering the law. Yet the courtroom revealed his vulnerabilities, the human limitations behind the myth. Strategy, intelligence, and foresight could delay consequences, but they could not eliminate exposure, betrayal, or legal accountability. The psychological complexity of the trial, the interplay of fear, loyalty, ambition, and morality, offered a nuanced portrait of both the man and the empire he had built. It was a pivotal moment in which narrative, perception, and consequence converged, reshaping both Luciano's life and the public understanding of organized crime. Ultimately, the trial and sentencing marked both an end and a transformation. For Luciano, it was a loss of freedom, a disruption of his empire, and an initiation into a new phase of existence. One in which influence, strategy, and adaptation would be tested under the constraints of incarceration. For history, it was a turning point in the evolution of organized crime, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated networks were subject to legal, social, and psychological pressures beyond the control of any individual. The courtroom, with all its drama, tension, and moral complexity, became both a stage for the man and a mirror of the world he had sought to command, illuminating the intricate interplay of power, consequence, and human ambition in the rise and fall of Lucky Luciano. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence did not wane. Prison, for most men, would have represented the definitive end of power, a forced retreat from the arena of control he had so meticulously crafted on the streets of New York. But Luciano was not like most men. He understood that power was not merely territorial or physical, it was psychological, structural, and relational. Even confined within the walls of a penitentiary, he remained a central node in the complex web of organized crime, orchestrating operations, managing alliances, and influencing decisions far beyond the prison gates. For Luciano, imprisonment was not an endpoint but a new arena in which his strategic mind and understanding of human behavior could be applied in equally sophisticated ways. The mechanics of control from prison were subtle yet effective. Luciano relied on a network of loyal lieutenants, trusted messengers, and intermediaries who acted as extensions of his will. Orders, strategies, and decisions were communicated through discreet channels, ensuring that his influence remained operative even as he faced legal restrictions. These intermediaries were carefully selected, their loyalty cultivated and tested over years of service. By leveraging the psychological bonds he had forged, Luciano maintained a semblance of command, orchestrating operations that continued to generate revenue and sustain his organizational hierarchy. His ability to operate remotely was a testament to both his foresight and his understanding of delegation. Power was not diminished by distance if relationships and loyalty were carefully managed. Even within the prison environment, Luciano demonstrated an acute understanding of social dynamics. He was not merely a passive occupant of his cell. He actively managed relationships with guards, fellow inmates, and administrative personnel. By leveraging charisma, negotiation, and strategic influence, he cultivated an environment in which he could operate with relative autonomy. This was an extension of his approach on the streets. Influence was cultivated through respect, fear, and reciprocal advantage. Even confined, Luciano's presence was felt, his authority acknowledged, and his strategic mind actively shaping outcomes. The prison, rather than breaking him, became a controlled microcosm in which he continued to exert psychological and operational influence. Financially, Luciano's operations continued to flourish despite incarceration. His network of enterprises, gambling, labor racketeering, and illicit trade, remained profitable, managed by lieutenants who adhered to his strategies. The system he had built was resilient, capable of functioning under pressure, and adaptable to external disruptions. By ensuring that trusted individuals oversaw key operations, Luciano could maintain revenue streams and operational control without direct physical intervention. This demonstrated not only the robustness of his empire but also his skill in designing a structure capable of withstanding shocks, both internal and external. Power, Luciano proved, was as much about system design as it was about personal presence. The psychological dimensions of his continued influence were equally significant. For his subordinates, the knowledge that Luciano remained in control, even from prison, reinforced loyalty and discipline. Orders were followed, alliances maintained, and rival factions deterred by the enduring presence of a strategist who could outmaneuver opposition even without leaving his cell. The threat of intervention, whether through punishment, strategic maneuvering, or reallocation of resources, ensured compliance. In effect, Luciano transformed incarceration from a limitation into a tool, using the constraints of prison to further cement his image as both omnipresent and inescapably powerful. The broader world outside prison was acutely aware of his ongoing influence. Competitors, law enforcement, and political figures recognized that Luciano's arrest had not ended his reach. His ability to manage, negotiate, and strategize remotely challenged conventional notions of criminal power, illustrating that leadership was not dependent solely on physical presence. This perception reinforced his authority, creating a psychological edge over rivals who underestimated the continued operational and strategic capacity of a man behind bars. Even in confinement, Luciano's empire adapted, demonstrating resilience, sophistication, and the enduring effectiveness of his systems. Luciano's continued command also involved adaptation to new realities. With the legal system and law enforcement increasingly attentive, he learned to operate with greater subtlety, masking decisions and minimizing exposure. Communication channels became more covert, delegation more strategic, and alliances carefully managed to prevent detection. This phase demonstrated an evolution in his operational philosophy. Survival and influence required not just power but discretion, patience, and the strategic orchestration of both human and systemic resources. The challenges of prison management highlighted the extent to which Luciano's genius was not limited to action but extended to anticipation, manipulation, and long-term planning. Even as he navigated the constraints of incarceration, Luciano remained a symbol of power, resilience, and strategic ingenuity. He demonstrated that true authority is multidimensional, extending beyond physical freedom to encompass psychological influence, systemic control, and strategic foresight. For those within his organization, he remained a leader to be respected and feared. For competitors, he was a cautionary figure whose reach could not be fully constrained. Prison was transformed from a place of punishment into a stage for demonstrating the depth and adaptability of his leadership. Luciano's ability to maintain influence from behind bars reinforced his legacy, establishing him as a figure whose genius lay not only in criminal enterprise but in the management of power itself. Ultimately, Luciano's time behind bars highlighted the durability of his vision and the sophistication of his systems. While incarceration represented a temporary removal from the streets, it did not end his empire. He had designed a structure capable of functioning independently, empowered by loyalty, fear, and intelligence, and guided by his strategic mind. In this way, imprisonment became a testament to his ingenuity. Even when constrained, he remained a force to be reckoned with, a central figure whose influence transcended physical boundaries. Through discipline, foresight, and psychological mastery, Lucky Luciano turned what might have been a period of defeat into an extension of his control, proving that true power is not merely positional but intellectual, relational, and systemic. The deportation of Lucky Luciano marked the beginning of a new chapter in a life defined by ambition, strategy, and relentless pursuit of power. For decades he had built and maintained an empire in the shadows of New York streets, commanding respect, fear, and loyalty through a combination of intellect, violence, and vision. Yet even the most formidable empires are vulnerable to the forces of law and politics. Following his conviction and imprisonment, the decision to deport him to Italy was not merely a punitive measure, it was an attempt to sever the man from the system he had carefully orchestrated, to isolate the architect from his creation, and to limit his influence over the criminal networks that had defined his life. In exile, Luciano faced both dislocation and the profound challenge of reimagining his role in a world he had once dominated. The journey back to Italy was symbolic as much as it was physical. Landing in a country that was at once familiar yet estranged, Luciano encountered a landscape that contrasted sharply with the power he had wielded in New York. The streets of Naples, once the cradle of his heritage, now carried the weight of a man who had been both celebrated and condemned abroad. He was a man without a territory, stripped of his immediate authority, yet carrying with him an enduring reputation and the lessons of decades spent mastering the interplay of human behavior, loyalty, and organized systems. Exile became a test of adaptation, resilience, and the capacity to wield influence in environments beyond his previous dominion. Despite the dislocation, Luciano's intellect and strategic acumen remained intact. He observed, assessed, and recalibrated, understanding that power could be exercised in multiple forms, not solely through physical control of territory or enterprises. His presence, reputation, and connections allowed him to continue influencing events across the Atlantic. The global reach of his network, established through alliances, loyalty, and psychological leverage, provided avenues for maintaining a degree of authority even from a distance. Exile was not merely an ending, it was an opportunity to explore influence in new domains, applying lessons of strategy, negotiation, and foresight to circumstances far removed from the streets of New York. The geopolitical context of the period also offered unexpected avenues for engagement. During World War II, Luciano's knowledge, connections, and strategic mind became assets not only to his organization but to broader national interests. Collaboration with U.S. authorities in matters of security and intelligence highlighted the complex intersection between crime, politics, and pragmatism. Luciano, ever the strategist, leveraged this period to negotiate advantages for himself and to demonstrate the continued utility of his expertise. Even in exile, the delicate balance of loyalty, influence, and opportunity allowed him to retain relevance, demonstrating that power was not confined to geography but could be exercised through negotiation, intelligence, and strategic positioning. Exile also offered a period of introspection and reflection. Stripped of immediate control, Luciano confronted the human costs of his ambitions. The betrayals, the violence, the moral compromises that had marked his rise. He grappled with the duality of his identity, the myth of the Don, a figure both feared and revered, and the man behind the legend, subject to the same vulnerabilities, limitations, and consequences as any human being. This period highlighted the psychological evolution of a figure who had spent a lifetime manipulating systems and people. Exile forced an awareness of mortality, legacy, and the impermanence of power. In this way, it was both a personal reckoning and a strategic pause, allowing him to assess the long-term consequences of his actions and the sustainability of his influence. Luciano's exile also emphasized the adaptability that had characterized his entire life. He navigated new social, political, and economic landscapes, applying lessons learned in New York to manage relationships, assert influence, and protect his interests. His reputation remained a tool, allowing him to negotiate with allies, rivals, and authorities alike. Exile demanded a recalibration of strategy. Direct control was no longer possible, so influence had to be exercised indirectly, through networks, perception, and negotiation. This shift demonstrated the universality of his strategic principles. Loyalty, fear, respect, and opportunity could be leveraged across contexts, proving that the essence of his power was intellectual and relational, not solely territorial. The latter years of Luciano's life in exile were marked by both continuity and transformation. He remained engaged with criminal networks, offering guidance, structuring alliances, and maintaining relationships forged over decades. At the same time, he cultivated a philosophical perspective on his own life, empire, and legacy. Exile provided space for reflection on the cyclical nature of power, its acquisition, maintenance, vulnerability, and ultimate impermanence. Luciano's strategic mind, once focused on immediate profit and territorial control, now considered the broader implications of leadership, morality, and human behavior. He had experienced the full arc of rise, dominance, vulnerability, and adaptation, a trajectory that few in history could claim. Ultimately, the exile of Lucky Luciano serves as a testament to the enduring power of intellect, strategy, and relational influence. While he had been removed from the epicenter of his empire, his understanding of human psychology, organizational systems, and the dynamics of loyalty allowed him to remain a figure of authority, relevance, and intrigue. Exile was both a punishment and an opportunity, a space in which he could continue exercising influence, adapt to new circumstances, and reflect on the legacy of a life defined by ambition, cunning, and audacity. It highlighted the distinction between transient authority and enduring power, illustrating that the truest form of influence resides not in location or immediate control but in the capacity to shape systems, relationships, and perception. In exile, the duality of Luciano's life became starkly apparent. He was simultaneously diminished and empowered, constrained and influential, mythologized and human. The lessons of his rise, fall, and adaptation during this period resonate far beyond the context of organized crime, offering insights into the nature of leadership, resilience, and the psychological dimensions of power. The exile was, in many ways, the final stage of his strategic evolution, a period in which the Don of New York became a global figure, a man negotiating legacy, influence, and survival beyond the immediate reach of law, territory, and empire. The legacy of Lucky Luciano extends far beyond the narrow confines of his lifetime and even beyond the streets of New York, marking a profound transformation in the nature of organized crime worldwide. He was not merely a gangster. He was a visionary, a strategist whose innovations redefined the very structure of criminal enterprise. Before Luciano, organized crime in America was fragmented, chaotic, and dominated by personal vendettas, territorial disputes, and short-term opportunism. Rival factions operated in isolation, often competing violently for control without any coordinated strategy. Luciano's genius lay in recognizing the inefficiency of this system and introducing a model that emphasized organization, hierarchy, and calculated collaboration, creating what would become a blueprint for modern organized crime. His influence, therefore, is not measured solely in terms of wealth or notoriety but in the enduring structural principles he established. Central to Luciano's legacy was the creation of the Mafia Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, coordinate operations, and maintain a balance of power among families. This innovation represented a dramatic departure from the anarchic power struggles of the past. By institutionalizing conflict resolution and fostering negotiation between rival factions, Luciano transformed the mafia into a system capable of long-term stability and efficiency. Decisions were no longer made solely by brute force or personal ambition. They were deliberated, structured, and executed through a system that prioritized sustainability and collective self-interest. The commission not only strengthened the power of individual families but also reinforced the integrity of the organization as a whole, demonstrating Luciano's capacity for strategic thinking and long-term planning. Luciano's approach to loyalty and fear also left an indelible mark on the culture of organized crime. He understood that power depended not only on resources and muscle but also on psychology. Loyalty had to be cultivated, tested, and rewarded, while betrayal required swift and uncompromising consequences. The principles of omerta, the code of silence and allegiance, were enforced with a combination of respect, intimidation, and opportunity. This psychological architecture created cohesion, discipline, and predictability within a world otherwise defined by chaos. Luciano demonstrated that the true currency of influence was not merely money or weapons but trust, perception, and the calculated management of human behavior. The integration of diverse criminal enterprises into a single organized network further solidified his influence. Luciano's vision was comprehensive. Gambling, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and other illicit activities were coordinated and interdependent, creating a system that was resilient, profitable, and difficult to dismantle. This approach represented a paradigm shift in criminal operations, moving from fragmented ventures to a sophisticated, multi-layered organization capable of adapting to legal pressures, market fluctuations, and rival threats. Luciano's model demonstrated that crime could be both strategic and sustainable, blending economic insight, operational planning, and psychological mastery, a blueprint that continues to influence organized crime to this day. Luciano's legacy is also cultural and symbolic. He became a figure both feared and admired, a mythologized embodiment of intelligence, audacity, and the complex interplay of morality and ambition. Stories of his exploits, alliances, and strategic ingenuity permeated popular culture, inspiring books, films, and documentaries that explore the intersection of crime, power, and human psychology. His life became a lens through which the public could examine the dynamics of ambition, loyalty, and morality, offering insights into both the allure and the peril of power. In this way, Luciano's influence extends beyond criminal structures into the collective imagination, shaping how generations understand the mechanics and psychology of leadership in extreme contexts. The international impact of Luciano's innovations cannot be overstated. By establishing systemic approaches to organized crime, he created models that transcended national borders. The structural principles he implemented, the Commission, integrated enterprises, and psychological governance, have been emulated by criminal organizations around the world, from Europe to Latin America. His methods illustrated that power is most enduring when exercised through systems, relationships, and strategic foresight rather than mere force. The resilience of these principles over decades is a testament to the depth of his vision and the sophistication of his approach. Yet Luciano's legacy is not without moral complexity. While his innovations created order and efficiency within criminal networks, they were built on exploitation, violence, and manipulation. He navigated and profited from human vulnerability, cultivating loyalty through fear and opportunity, often at the expense of those ensnared in his operations. The ethical contradictions of his life, ambition versus morality, loyalty versus betrayal, vision versus destruction, remain central to his story. These tensions make him a figure of enduring fascination, a man whose brilliance was inseparable from the moral compromises and human costs that defined his world. His life challenges us to consider the interplay between intelligence, strategy, and ethical responsibility in contexts defined by extreme power and danger. The enduring relevance of Luciano's methods also lies in their adaptability. The principles he established, the integration of enterprises, the management of loyalty and fear, the strategic coordination of alliances, remain applicable to understanding modern criminal networks and even organizational behavior in broader contexts. Scholars, criminologists, and strategists study his life not merely for its sensational details but for the insights it provides into leadership, risk management, and systemic control. His legacy, therefore, is both historical and analytical, offering lessons in strategy, resilience, and the complex dynamics of human behavior under pressure. Ultimately, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is defined by the synthesis of vision, strategy, and psychological mastery. He transformed organized crime from fragmented chaos into an enduring, sophisticated system, blending operational innovation with human insight. His influence reshaped the underworld, left an imprint on global criminal structures, and provided a lasting framework for understanding the interplay of power, loyalty, and strategy. The man who once walked the streets of New York with audacity and intellect became more than a criminal. He became a paradigm, a case study in the architecture of power, the complexity of human relationships, and the enduring consequences of vision executed with ruthless precision. Luciano's story is a testament to the capacity of one individual to reshape an entire system, for better or worse, leaving a mark that transcends time, geography, and morality. As Lucky Luciano's story draws to a close, the arc of his life, from a streetwise immigrant boy to the architect of modern organized crime, reveals both brilliance and complexity. His journey embodies the dualities of human ambition: vision versus morality, loyalty versus betrayal, and control versus vulnerability. Luciano's rise demonstrated how intelligence, strategy, and foresight could transform chaos into a structured empire, while his fall and exile revealed the fragility of power in the face of law, betrayal, and circumstance. The myth of Luciano often overshadows the man himself. To the public, he is the untouchable Don, a mastermind who controlled an empire with precision. Yet he was also a human being, shaped by hardship, circumstance, and ambition, navigating opportunities and risks in a morally ambiguous world. His story underscores the intersection of personal drive and historical forces, showing how individual agency can exploit social, economic, and political conditions to extraordinary effect. Luciano's legacy is profound. By creating the Mafia Commission, structuring criminal enterprises, and mastering the psychology of loyalty and fear, he established a blueprint for organized crime that would endure globally. His innovations transformed the underworld into a sophisticated, coordinated system, proving that real power lies not only in force but in strategy, influence, and perception. At the same time, his life is a cautionary tale. The very methods that secured his dominance, manipulation, violence, and exploitation, also exposed him to downfall. His journey demonstrates the impermanence of power and the necessity of adaptability, foresight, and resilience. Luciano's story closes as both legend and lesson, a testament to human ingenuity, the complexities of leadership, and the enduring consequences of ambition executed with audacity and precision.